We are going to record this. So once that's going,
All set.
okay. All right. So welcome everybody. I am Cynthia Roman, curator of prints, drawings, and paintings at the Walpole Library. We are so pleased that so many of you could join us for this virtual talk today by Andrew Rudd, who has been guest curator for the current Walpole Library exhibition. And it's wonderful to see so many familiar names and lots of new ones too. So the exhibit that Andrew curated is called Knight Errant of the Distressed, Horace, Walpole, and Philanthropy in 18th Century London. And I just want to throw in a plug that the exhibit can be viewed both in person and online. And for those of you who have not seen it, we encourage you to visit one way or the other. And more information is available online. I think Kristen just put a link into the chat. So today, Andrew will speak to us on print philanthropy in the age of Horace Walpole. And just a brief introduction. Dr. Rudd is senior lecturer in in the English department at the University of Exeter. He researches and teaches British literature of the 18th century and Romantic periods. His monograph, Sympathy and India in British Literature, 1770 to 1830, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2011. He is currently writing a cultural history of charity in the 18th century, and this builds on experience he acquired as a parliamentary manager at the Charity Commission for England and Wales before he joined Exeter in 2013. Dr. Rudd holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he has studied at the University of Durham, Trinity College, Cambridge, and Yale University. He has held numerous fellowships, most recently at Yale's Walpole Library, where this exhibit had its genesis, and at the School of Advanced Studies in English, the University of Jadavapur, and he speaks regularly at conferences, seminars, and public events. Since 2015, he's been a member of the Arts and Humanities Research Council Peer Review College. And also another opportunity to promote ourselves here. We are looking forward to Andrew's return to Yale next spring when he will lead a collections-based graduate student seminar on philanthropy at the Walpole Library. That's scheduled for March 24th, and please watch for further details and encourage your graduate students to join us. That's going to be open both to Yale and non-Yale students. So before we get started and turn this over to Andrew, as always, the Zoom reminders. So please keep yourselves muted during the talk, and we will invite discussion following. You may put your comments or ask your questions either by raising your hand, reaction button at the bottom of your screen, or if you prefer, you can put questions in chat, and we will monitor that. And Kristen McDonald will help me. And as always, I want to just say thank you to Kristen, who always helps these things run smoothly. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and a very warm welcome to everybody, wherever in the world you may be. I'll just get the presentation up. There we are. Print philanthropy in the age of Horace Walpole. On the 3rd of February 1760, midway through the 7 Years' War, Walpole wrote to his long-standing correspondent, Horace Mann, ambassador to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. An earthquake had rocked Holland, and Walpole objected to what he called the Dutch giving themselves terra firma airs, and he preferred to call it a mudquake. But Walpole was commenting on the large sums of money raised for public relief and reconstruction, and he went on to compare this to the most prominent philanthropic cause then in his own country. Don't you like much more our noble national charity? Above £2,000 has been raised in London alone besides what is collected in the country, for the French prisoners abandoned by their monarch? Must not it make the Romans blush in their Appian way, who dragged their prisoners in triumph? We abound in great charities. The distress of war seems to heighten rather than diminish them. Walpole was referring to the subscription charities advertised in periodicals and promoted by John Wesley, among others, for French prisoners of war confined at various military installations around the country during the bitter winter of 1759-1760. Now, Horace Mann himself was the proprietor of Sissinghurst, which was one of the places where French soldiers were housed. Mann had lived in Florence from 1737, which allowed him to lease the property out to the government for use as a prison. The National Trust in Britain possesses this sketch of Sissinghurst being used as a prison with British and French soldiers visible. It's thought that this sketch was made by a French prisoner around 1761. There are some scenes of violent disorder of some kind up in the top left. Clothing was the great issue. The French king had, in breach of the conventions of war in force at the time, withdrawn the allowances normally paid to one's own prisoners being held in another country. As Walpole reported, charitably minded Britons were increasingly alarmed by the conditions in which the French soldiers were being held, and they mobilised resources on their behalf. The printed word was vital to the fundraising effort, as it was to debate over that perennial bugbear of philanthropy, fear of fraud. As well as the printed subscription lists, which circulated widely throughout the nation, allowing people with middling incomes to donate what they could and contribute to the cause, publications such as a letter from a gentleman in town to his friend in the country concerning the clothing of the French prisoners now in the Castle of Edinburgh, published in Edinburgh in 1759, addressed head-on complaints which sprang up that the predicament of the French prisoners was completely fake. One newspaper correspondent had alleged that the 300 French prisoners who had marched in rags through the Scottish capital had in fact staged an elaborate hoax on the populace and were in possession not only of clothing and victuals in abundance, but they actually had the missing allowance from the French king into the bargain. Another newspaper correspondent accused the fundraisers of plotting to employ the French prisoners in Edinburgh Castle as a secret Jacobite army, who at any point might burst from the castle gates and fall on the defenceless city. Now, the author of the 1759 publication provided a helpful back and forth of the letters of this sort that had been published in the newspapers, the Edinburgh Courant and the Caledonian Mercury, to allow readers to make up their own mind. And in a demonstration of faith in statistics to create transparency in philanthropic enterprises, the publication also included this table to show the exact numbers of prisoners who possessed no shirt. This is looking from left to right across the table, or only one shirt, and exactly how many jackets, vests, breeches, stockings, shoes, and caps were needed. If any further explanation is necessary, the table concludes, apply to Mr. James Seaton, a prominent Edinburgh banker and merchant. Now, the French prisoners of war affair illustrates how closely interwoven print culture was with the philanthropic practices of 18th century Britain, often considered by optimistically minded commentators to be the defining characteristic of the age. Wesley himself averred that more hospitals, infirmaries, and other places of public charity have been created, at least in or near London, within this century than in 500 years before. Print partnered philanthropy in diverse ways. For example, aid was solicited directly from the printed page in the case of the tailor turned religious controversialist Robert Hill, who unfortunately had fallen on evil times. Joseph Spence's parallel in the manner of Plutarch between a most celebrated man of Florence and one scarce ever heard of in England, published at Walpole's Strawberry Hill Press in 1758, was designed to raise money for Hill, contained this direct appeal to subscribers to deposit cash donations at the premises of booksellers in London, Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Dublin, Tunbridge, Bath, Bristol, York, Durham, Ipswich, Norwich, Winchester, Salisbury, and Buckingham, and they may be assured that whatever may be thus collected shall be put to the properest use for the service of him and his family. The parallel, incidentally, is with Antonio Magliabecchi, the notoriously frugal Medici librarian who, unlike Hill, enjoyed great fame in his own lifetime. Elsewhere, print was a vehicle for extending the reach and fundraising potential of that staple of 18th century philanthropy, the charity sermon, typically preached on behalf of a charity school that was supported by voluntary donations, which could, of course, be supplemented by the sale of the published sermon. Now, on the screen is an example from the Lewis Walpole Library's collections, which appears in the exhibition. It's a reasonably typical example of how the spoken word found its way into print in a philanthropic way. This is Robert Robinson's Christianity, a System of Humanity, a sermon in behalf of the Protestant dissenting charity school at Horsley Down, Southwark, published in 1779. The charity school children of London, incidentally, who were corralled in vast processions towards St. Paul's Cathedral each Ascension Day, were famously the subject of William Blake's Holy Thursday poems. The innocent version, shown here, which shows the charity school children marching, walking two and two in red and blue and green, praises the donor's generosity, while the experienced version excoriated the need for charity to exist in a rich and fruitful land in the first place. This is essentially the dialectic that governs debates for and against philanthropy down to our own times. Now, Blake's illuminated hand printing, of course, produced one-offs, but reusable printed ephemera were widely used in 18th century fundraising, as seen in this example of a ticket to a benefit concert engraved by Francesco Bertolozzi after Robert Smirke. It's a ticket for a concert to be held at the King's Theatre, Haymarket, produced presumably around in 1798. And if you look at the top, you can see that the exact date has been left blank to be filled in by hand, so that the ticket can be used for any day in May during the 1790s. It's an indication of the sheer volume of events that took place to support good causes in 18th century London and around the country. Also reusable was this earlier splendid example from the Foundling Hospital. The Foundling Hospital, you may know, was a charity established to care for London's abandoned children. And here is the coat of arms produced by William Hogarth with the sort of lamb, an abandoned baby in the middle, and the motto, "Help," underneath. But it's an invitation to a concert, to a sacred oratorio composed by the charity's great musical patron, George Frederick Handel. Now, the governors were obviously expecting large audiences, and consequently they were mindful of physical space. So if you look down towards the bottom, you can see the rather charming instruction: "The gentlemen are desired to come without swords, and the ladies without hoops," both of which would have caused physical awkwardness in the crowded concert space. Then, as today, philanthropy was a social affair, and print materials with elegant allegorical designs showing sainted charity in league with the muses played their part in conjuring the requisite aura and mood of generosity among those who attended. This topographical print of the Foundling Hospital, dating from 1753, gives you some sense of the institution's significance as a place of fashionable resort, how it occupied part of the public sphere of 18th century London, as the great and good and the middling sort could come along to look not only at the foundling children themselves, but hear music by Handel and others, and to look at the charity's famous collection of art, which is still held in trust in London by the Foundling Museum, as it's now become. The so-called objects of charity, the beneficiaries themselves, who perhaps don't feature in this talk as much as they could or should, had an important role too. They were both effective pretexts for stimulating in donors the pleasurable sensation of relieving the needy and satisfying the circumspect as to the charity's public utility. Proud as 18th century Britons were of their magnanimity, they were also anxious that the vast sums of money raised for good causes might not be properly directed. This was the reason why the economically minded Daniel Defoe notoriously called ad hoc almsgiving to beggars as, quote, a scandal on the charity of the nation, because it was not in the national interest. There was, too, a misplaced belief that the population was falling, which, especially in wartime, meant potentially not enough hands to man the Navy's ships, to fill the ranks in the army, or to till the fields. This printed invitation to a dinner with the offices of the Lying In charity from 1778 speaks to these anxieties, and consequently bears the motto at the top, increase of children, a nation's strength. And at the sides, it depicts the useful roles that poor boys on the left and poor girls on the right might be expected to play in national life after they had been saved from the danger of stillbirth, which was the purpose of the Lying In charity, which catered to poor women who were giving birth in their own homes. The ticket has been numbered at the top left, 421, which again gives us an indication of the size of fundraising gala events of this sort in the 18th century. More controversial charities, such as the Magdalen Charity, which was established for the rehabilitation of penitent prostitutes, made thoughtful use of print prospectuses, such as this, to reassure donors that their purposes were beneficial and that the institution itself was run with godly orderliness. This frontispiece to William Dodd's account of the rise, progress, and present state of the Magdalen Charity, published in 1763, shows one of the Magdalene's beneficiaries in plain, modest garb, with a demure expression, fit for the humble but respectable employment she might reasonably expect to obtain outside the institution walls. The publication contains Dodd's sermons, including the one preached before the Duke of York, which Walpole heard and wrote about, hymns, prayers, and the rules which govern the Magdalene's daily life, in another commitment to transparency. Also included is the crucial list of subscribers, typically headed by aristocrats and other respectable names who might cause others to emulate them and donate. This widely circulated volume and others like it could at the same time promote the charity, head off criticism, and actively assist fundraising. And such multiple purposes explain the often frequent complexity of philanthropic title pages, such as this. But I want to suggest that written and visual print culture operated on another level too, in what I call the print-gift relationship. Gift relationships, the concept, typically refers to relations between the giver and the recipient of gifts in the moment of exchange. In the gift relationship, there is reciprocity, a gift in exchange for gratitude or for social kudos, and numerous critics, notably Pierre Bourdieu in his outline of a theory of practice, argued that gift relationships were far from altruistic, but freighted with asymmetric power relations, where the giver is always in a position of mastery somehow over the receiver. We do not have time here to debate the exact nature of the gift relationship, but I do want to think about how and what it means for gift relationships to be recreated in print, by proxy, as it were, as some of the materials I have shown arguably do. Gift relationships involve an element of performance, with the recipient typically required to adopt a so-called posture of supplication, to solicit and to deserve the aid they receive. Clearly, in a print gift relationship produced by an intermediary, the posture of supplication can be controlled more closely and made visually or emotionally more intense or more palatable as the situation warrants. Publications that sought to create print gift relationships drew heavily on the register of sentimentality. And indeed, there are clear parallels between print philanthropy and sentimental fiction, with the emphasis in both on arousing and sustaining the reader's emotional interest. At this point, I want to bring Walpole back into the picture. For in 1785, his friend Mary Hamilton, governess to the royal princes and princesses, enclosed two printed accounts, Walpole called them melancholy narratives, of one Louisa, a mentally ill woman who had been discovered living rough under a haystack outside Bristol in 1776. It is highly likely that one of the narratives Hamilton sent to Walpole was A Tale of Real Woe, published in the St. James's Chronicle in November 1781, which was written by Hannah More under the nom de plume Lover of Truth. More, I think, intuited Louisa's potential resemblance to a heroine on the wilder fringes of the novel of sensibility, but he took pains to reassure readers that her story, quote, does not require any ornament from fiction or any embellishment from language. Louisa's story, in brief, was that in 1776, she knocked on the door of a cottage near Bristol and begged for milk, intriguing the local community with her dishevelled appearance combined with what were described as manners graceful and elegant, and her countenance interesting to the last degree. Locals tried without success to take Louisa in, and she was briefly confined to an asylum for the treatment of mental illness. But Louisa preferred her haystack, and she remained there for 4 years, adorning it with items of jewellery which people had given to her as gifts. According to the sensationalist French and German translations of Louisa's story, she spoke with a thick German accent and insisted to all who would listen that she was the illegitimate daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. Whenever the mail coach passed by, she would always remark that her father's carriage was always driven by 8 horses. More, who had by this time taken Louisa under her wing, even examined Louisa's skull to investigate claims that she had fallen from a coach in Sweden, and indeed, More found scars in the crown of Louisa's head and behind her ear. Louisa was, perhaps inevitably in this historical period, dubbed the Maid of the Haystack. Her case, I suggest, is a prime example of print philanthropy working through the widespread circulation of an affecting narrative intended to elicit material assistance. More trusted that her reader donors needed no ornament from fiction or any embellishment from language, however much Louisa's plight outmatched for outlandishness any sentimental novel. For More, the tale of woe was a hook, predicated chiefly on affect to effect change in real life. More wrote, her own words here, "This artless story is written with no other view but the warm hope that it may catch the eye of someone interested in this tale of woe, and the ardent wish of restoring an amiable and wretched young creature to the arms of, perhaps, a broken-hearted parent." This provides us with a context for Walpole's reply to Hamilton when the news story circulated his way in October 1783. Sorry, not 1785, as I said earlier, it's 1783. Walpole could sometimes be flippant, even churlish, when friends pressed him for charitable donations. But his letter suggests that Louisa's story, admittedly glossed by Hamilton's letter, touched a chord with him. Walpole offered to redeem Louisa's asylum fees if she genuinely wanted to leave, but he reflected that staying there and receiving modern treatment might be the more humane thing to do. Walpole also referred to the example of his nephew, Lord Orford, who had been declared insane, and two families similarly afflicted who were dependent on Walpole for money. We don't know very much about these two families, but we do know that Walpole left money to at least one of them in his will. Walpole's preference, following More's cue, was to trace Louisa's family in Germany, and to this end, he placed his diplomatic connections at Hamilton's disposal. Hamilton was based at the court and in a good position to use them. Walpole's letter concludes with reflections on what I feel is the key feature of 18th century print philanthropy, that it mobilizes sentimentality, but with the specific aim of achieving a practical outcome. This perhaps excuses it from the charge we often find levelled at the sentimental novel, that it's self-indulgent, that it fired up emotion for emotion's sake. And Walpole, in his reply to Hamilton, seems to have rejected this idea of what Louisa's melancholy narrative might represent. Put the text from his letter on the screen. He wrote, "We are not to act on hypotheses of our own imagination and shun investigation when positive good may be done." He continued, "Activity, not speculation and refinement, is demanded of us." At the same time, Walpole criticised the perhaps opposing tendency seen in the Edinburgh controversy over the French prisoners of war to try to rationalise away or find excuses to dismiss the need for action. His letter continues, "We are to act to numb that activity and indulge our own laziness and want of feeling by specious arguments, which we call common sense. Sentiment trumps reason then, but only if the outcome is a material benefit to someone beyond ourselves." Then Walpole goes on to compare himself to Don Quixote. He writes, "If it is ever justifiable to good sense to act romantically, it is by being the knights errant of the distressed." This is where the exhibition title came from. "Louisa shall be my Dulcinea, madam, and you shall be the Duchess who countenances me." Just as a quick reminder, this comes from the second part of Don Quixote, where Don Quixote is sort of being teased by a duchess who sets him off on all sorts of quests, and Dulcinea, of course, is Don Quixote's imagined lover or mistress. Now, even while the fact that Don Walpole, as it were, is spurred into action by actual, not fancied stress, the letter is pointedly ironic. Print philanthropy deals in reality, however much it may borrow the garb of sentimental romance, seems to be Walpole's position. Now, just to finish off, we do not know what exertions Walpole did actually make on Louisa's behalf, but it seems her family was not traced, and we know she died in St. Guy's Hospital for incurables in December 1800. To her great credit, Hannah More paid Louisa's funeral expenses. This marked the end of a long campaign that had seen Louisa supported through voluntary subscriptions and promoted through the mass circulation of her story in print, whose resemblance to sentimental fiction was galvanized to turn feeling into funding. Across the increasingly interconnected spaces of 18th century Britain, I conclude, print spread and would continue to spread in an ever-widening arc, its web of philanthropy. Thank you very much. I shall stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really terrific. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. Actually, we had a comment from Lucas Held during the talk, commenting that it's it's wonderful that disputes about facts are not unique to the early 20th century.
How very true.
And so I guess we can open the floor to questions. Either raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Do I see Georgina raising her hand behind?
Yes, that's right. Hi. I was just wondering, sorry, we haven't got much room in here. I was just wondering if any kind of little volumes of scripts, you talked about theatre. I was just wondering if any kind of scripts, having been to a sort of charitable event or a benefit, were printed and sold to the general, to the public, or whether there were perhaps poems or books served, not served, offered for sale on a charitable kind of income basis.
Yes, thank you very much, Georgina. Yes, the answer is yes. The live events could be sort of extended. Their use could be extended by publishing the script, as you say, of a sort of benefit play, and poetry was also written to raise money for people who needed it. Sometimes, particularly for struggling authors, in particular, as many of you will know, a subscription edition could be produced for the benefit of the person who wrote the poems in the same volume. And that was an acknowledged form of philanthropic support at the time. And those texts were produced quite widely. Horace Walpole himself was involved in an abortive attempt to stage a benefit play for one of the causes who had sort of taken his interest, who is mentioned in the exhibition, the curious case of Theodore von Neuhoff, the supposed king of Corsica, who wound up in a debtor's prison, in the King's Bench debtor's prison in London, and Walpole proposed to mount a benefit performance of King Lear, the archetypal monarch brought low by his own poor judgment, which is how he saw this character, and he wanted to have David Garrick in the main role. But the subscription for this man failed, and they only raised £50, whereas his debt stood at 1,500. So it was a very common thing to do. And as with charity sermons, and as with poems, yes, putting it into print and circulating it more widely obviously amplified the sort of philanthropic effects of what had initially been conceived as a live event, for example. So yes, it was very widespread. And the crucial thing is to look out for the keyword, subscription edition, or a work produced for the benefit of somebody. Mm-hmm. It's sometimes quite subtle, but you can see from the title pages when a sort of work of print is acting philanthropically, as it were.
So I see David has his hand up, and Zoe, but I just wanted to quickly go to Lucas Held. I know he couldn't stay long, but he put a question in the chat, so I'm not sure if he's still there, but he's going to listen to the recording. So his question is, I had a question about the use of images, which I found fascinating, given the new research about the power of images to arouse emotion. And so he had to go to another meeting, but we'd love to know the thoughts about
yeah, very much. And I sort of happily, of course, it's being recorded, isn't it? It's fine. So otherwise
yes,
I could email.
Anyone else?
But yeah, I mean, with the arts across the board were sort of really mobilised in the service of philanthropy, and visual art foremost among them. The sentimental mode appeared very strongly in depictions of the needy in this period, often children or women in distress, though not always. And sort of one could either go down the route of a sort of modern, almost like a genre painting, showing the sort of needy people one might actually see out and about in 18th century Britain and set an example. or one could go down the biblical or allegorical route and depict, this is what Hogarth very, very often did, and took exemplary examples of charity from the Bible, the Good Samaritan and so forth. Or at the Foundling Hospital, they had paintings of Moses being taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, which provided a neat biblical precedent for what the Foundling Hospital actually did. It took in abandoned children and looked after them, so you have a biblical example to work from. Or sometimes painters could combine the sort of the biblical and the allegorical mode and the modern sentimental mode. There's a very interesting example of Edward Penny's painting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, of the Marquis of Granby, who was known, the military commander, known for his generosity, reaching down from his horse to give relief to a family of a poor injured soldier who is by the wayside, and that painting is a modern update of the parable of the Good Samaritan, and actually modelled on preceding artworks set in the biblical period. So that the art could do at least one of several things. It could provide potential donors with models of what they might do in imitation of biblical and classical forebears, and it could also focus sentimentality onto the potential recipients of charity by showing their distress, and as it were, sort of summoning in the viewer, the potential donor, feelings of compassion, and crucially a desire to act. So the visual culture did often depict the act of helping, not just the feeling. It's the action that's important. And there's also a very, very complex visual language of the sort of more ephemeral philanthropic objects as well. They very often use the sort of the allegorical figure of charity, this sort of often sort of many-breasted woman with many children gathered about her, and showed this figure sort of in the presence of the arts, and sort of so you have philanthropy and the arts working together, and that's the purpose of the concert or the exhibition or whatever it is. So it makes audiences feel that although they are taking part in a sort of pleasurable evening and hearing music, they are nevertheless doing something that will help people. Again, I don't think anything's changed there with sort of benefit concerts or exhibitions or anything of that sort. It's still the same idea, isn't it?
No, actually, in the Lisa Johnson has said the terrific talk, print philanthropy has not changed, which
yes,
is
quite.
one of the things I find fascinating about this topic. So we have a couple other questions waiting. Zoe, you have your hand raised, I think maybe next, and then we have David and Joelle in the chat. So Zoe, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, you mentioned the idea that this talk could feature the people that the charities were ostensibly helping more, and you mentioned the story of Louisa. But I was wondering how you go about, or if you have any thoughts on how to actually reach the stories in your research of the people who were part of these charities, and how you think about reaching sort of unmediated stories, or what their experiences, actually were in these charities.
Oh, thanks, Zoe. That's a really, really good question, and that last bit is very hard. And there's a lot of very exciting ongoing work being done at the moment by people like Stephen King and others, and Ayla Levine, who are trying to sort of reconstruct the position of recipients or people who solicited charity. And it can be done, but it is always very heavily mediated. Because on the other side of the equation, there's another aspect of print culture, which is the sort of the model letter of appeal, or the model petition, which people who were in need could use as a template, and perhaps get someone else to write their own details in if they were unable to read or write. But print culture provided a model for the poor and the needy to address formal appeals to people who might help them. And I think there's much more work to be done on that, because I suspect these things will be very, very widespread. And I kind of want to get a bit of a handle on sort of quite how widespread that practice was. I think it was quite wide. I suspect it was quite widespread in philanthropy. We know it was very widespread in the English poor law system, where people who'd fallen into pauperism had to produce communications to the parish officials to prove that they were needy and in need of relief and so on. And again, there were just loads and loads of printed templates that allowed people to do that. But you know, there's an element of performance involved in that, and it's very hard to know. I haven't yet come across a huge amount of information about of sort of unmediated people sort of writing or talking somehow about what it was like.
Thank you.
But I think we'll get there. I think we'll get there. There's a lot of work going on now about trying to sort of reconstruct that. Well, you know, what has previously been sort of very, very marginalized aspect of print culture, and taking a good look at it as it deserves.
Okay, we have in the chat, we have Joelle Del Rose. Wonderful
yes.
talk. So interesting. You mentioned a few groups in need of charity. I was wondering if you have anything to say about the orphan girls taught to make lace or taught artistic skills for the benefit of national commerce. And then maybe related, Emily's Bonal says, really wonderful talk. Thank you. I'm excited for your book. How do you see the role of gender in philanthropy? I think those are maybe connected. Anyway.
Yeah, they are connected. And again, very good questions. And again, perhaps sort of answers on both side of the gift relationship fence, perhaps. As regards the orphan girls themselves, and indeed children in many 18th century philanthropic institutions, the roles they were expected to go on to play and what their sort of limited education and training prepared them for were very, very heavily gendered, and sort of curiously embodied in the statues that you often find or found and still can find outside charity schools around the country, which date from the 18th century, where, you know, the roles of poor boys and the roles of poor girls actually sort of, you know, figuratively appear above the door of the school. And you very often find the girls wearing sort of neat bonnets and carrying distaffs and with wool or some other materials sort of in their hands. That's actually in the statue. And that's signaling very, very clearly that that's going to be the principal activity of the children during their time at this school and afterwards. And the boys are very often pictured holding their articles of apprenticeship, showing that that's what's going to happen to them. They're going to be articled to various sort of craftspeople, and that's what they'll be doing for the rest of their days. Or sometimes you have there are some statues showing them holding fairly sort of crude account books, the other sort of thing they might do. So as regards the recipients, their sort of life, their sort of future life chances were sort of very predetermined along gender lines. I think that's certainly the case, and it's rather, you know, they're directed very, very narrowly along particular paths. I think it's not unknown that poor children who went to these sorts of charities were able to kind of break out and make something of themselves. I think boys who went into the Army and the Navy perhaps had a particularly strong chance of being able to do that because the Navy was relatively egalitarian. But for the most part, that is what they would do. As regards the sort of more middling sort of people who are actually sort of involved in philanthropy, it's the gender didn't play the same. I don't think philanthropy hadn't become as starkly gendered as sort of 19th century philanthropy, where philanthropic activity was firmly associated with sort of women's work. I don't think that had yet really crystallized in the 18th century, where there are both prominent and very, very active men and women leading causes in a practical way. So I think there's still a bit more of a mix in those terms. And all of the sort of depictions we can see of crowds and visitors to these charities sort of appear to show sentimental reactions in both sort of men and women. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, we have a couple of comments which I can read after, but I see Joe Roach has his hand raised.
Yep.
Joe.
Thank you, Andrew, for a splendid talk. I have it's a thought bubble as much as a question, and it invites your comment. It seems to me that in a century where there's a shift between kinship as the standard of relations to the opening up of a social contract, at least philosophically, if not practically, that the orphan is ground zero, having no relations of kinship to rely on, but therefore put forward as it happens in the literature of the period. Orphans proliferate more so, I believe, than antiquity, certainly, and more than the early modern. Little goody two-shoes being the example that just floats into my head, but there are so many more. And I wonder what you think about that as the intellectual, philosophical construct underlying the philanthropy of which you speak in such vivid detail.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of framing it, because it's the idea of I think the idea of the social contract connects to the idea of national interest that was put about so widely in connection to philanthropy in this period, because the debate about philanthropy often involved a sense that we are all in this together as a nation, working towards a sort of single common effort, and everybody has their part to play in that. But in order to achieve that effort, which was sometimes, very often in this period, fighting wars, but not exclusively, just prospering in general. I think that you also get the countervailing idea that that the nation was obliged to look after these young people, as you say, and sort of enter into loco parentis with them through the form of these charitable institutions. So yeah, you can see them as providing surrogate family structures for these children. I think that was understood explicitly. At the Foundling Hospital, they renamed the children as they came in, very, very often after the governors. So all the children were renamed after this sort of limited set of people who were their governors and their guardians, and in effect, the parental figure for them. Eventually, they ran out of governors to name people after and had to widen the circle a bit. But yeah, there's plenty in the imagery too of the nation in the form of Britannia or whatever looking after orphans in a parental capacity, in a way that certainly fits with emerging ideas of the social contract. I should add though that one of the heartrending things about the Foundling Hospital is that they always, you mentioned kinship initially, they did leave it open for the poor mothers to come back for their children if that mother's circumstances had changed. And one of the most sort of moving things about the collection is they have these tokens that were left with the children that a mother could use to reclaim her child if she was able to come back and present the corresponding piece. So there was that element of sort of kinship, the possibility of kinship left open, but I don't think that happened terribly often.
I think that's right. Thank you so much. That's very illuminating.
Okay. I think, David, you've been patiently waiting and your hand is still up.
Thanks very much. Really interesting talk. Fantastic. What I was going to ask you about is debt, which philanthropy for debt, which of course was there was there deserving and undeserving debt, if you like? And my example is actually drawn from something which is in the Lewis Walpole library. It's a theatre playbill for a performance in Canterbury in Kent in 1772, actually 2 performances. And what happens is that some amateur local people, I guess, who, ladies and gentlemen, for their diversion, that this is on the playbill, they have a performance for people who are in debt in the local jail, and it names them. There are 2 guys who've been in there for over a year. And I just wondered, as a theatrical example, of course, the thing about a theatre performance is by amateurs is that the theatre performers, the local amateurs, must have got together to do a benefit for the people in debt, and people have to turn up and kind of, and pay in the audience. And the issue is really all that which comes back to what Walpole is saying about activity, and you've also talked about performance in a kind of a wider sense. But where does it just asks you to say something more about theatrical performances for debt, and where debt stands as something clearly the nation does not have an obligation to pay my debts. You see what I mean? So just ask you to say more about that.
Yes, and I'd be very interested to find out more about the playbill you mentioned, David. But
and they did another performance later in the year as well. People.
On the subject, certainly on the subject of debt. The relief of debtors was a time-honoured charitable activity. My mind's gone a bit of a blank. Is it one of the work? It might be one of the works of mercy specifically, but certainly the relief of debtors found its way into the Charity Act of Elizabeth I, which you could even see traces of it sort of back in bits of Piers Plowman. It was obviously a very long established thing that this is what you should do. I don't know about deserving and undeserving debtors so much as solvent and insolvent debtors. I think that was the distinction I've seen in the literature, and the relief of poor debtors specifically was a very, very big thing in 18th century philanthropy. These were the people who were imprisoned in the debtors' prison, often in a separate section from the more sort of respectable debtors, and they were completely dependent on external charity to buy food and the things they needed, and this was something that 18th century society just did as a matter of course. The debtors' prison in London by the Fleet River had a grill outside it through which the poor debtors appealed directly to passers-by with a sign above it saying, "Pray remember poor debtors," and people could hand them money through the grate. Horace Walpole was very involved in this, and we've got letters of his instructing his man of business, Grosvenor Bedford, to take guineas anonymously to the Fleet prison to relieve poor debtors there when, for example, there are outbreaks of fever. So there's a nice connection of Walpole himself to the relief of debtors. I guess it would make sense, if the situation was particularly bad in one's local debtors' prison, it would make sense to organise a benefit event such as the plays that you've seen. I wonder if it was done, I don't know if it was done sort of regularly or whether it was done staged to provide a specific boost at a particular moment of need.
I mean, it more or less coincides with the John Howard, he happens to refer to, the Canterbury as the base, but it's an interesting example. And thank you very much for that answer.
Thank you.
Okay, we're getting up on an hour, but we have some further chats. Amy Freud, wonderful talk. Introducing any change over the 18th century. I'm working on charity in the 1700s, and I see an emphasis on public utility, but sentimentality you identify hasn't emerged yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I share. That's a good question. I was keeping my eye on it, but it's yeah, the sort of the culture of sort of sensibility and sentiment sort of really sort of got going a few sort of decades later on, more towards the mid-century point. And when one looks at discussions of charity and philanthropy from the earlier period, you know, from the late 17th century through to the early 1700s, it tends to take the form of projects, doesn't it? You know, people sort of putting forward a proposal for something that will benefit the nation in measurable terms, sort of demonstrable utility. I'm thinking of a couple of essays by John Locke, which were framed in, you know, philanthropy framed in economic terms. No, this is why we should do such and such a thing. It will contribute this amount, or rather, it will save the nation this amount of money if we put our charity on a more efficient footing rather than giving out money indiscriminately. And Daniel Defoe, I think, comes from the same place, where he offers a set of very, very detailed proposals that will put the local poor to work and reduce the need to sort of waste money, as he sees it, in almsgiving locally. Going back even further, there's the sort of moral reform movement of people who were generally reacting against the dissolution of the Restoration era, sort of societies for the improvement of morals, of this sort of curtain twitching type organizations, that a society for the suppression of vice is what I mean. Sorry, I just forgot its name. So yes, I think the sentimentality, the idea that we should be motivated by affect, by our sort of feeling response to what we see. It's difficult to pinpoint a particular moment, but you know, over the 1740s, 1750s, and then sort of all the way through. But then, of course, in the later 18th century, there are sort of further developments again when a sort of more utilitarian sentiment begins to enter the debate, which in many ways actually recaps that earlier economically motivated approach to it, which arguably you see in the effective altruism philosophical movement going on at the moment, where the emphasis is very much on maximizing the sort of measurable benefits of philanthropy. So yes, big changes over the 18th century. Yeah. And I'd like to, please, let's be in touch about this. If you'd like to talk further, I'd really like to do that, if you would.
Great, thank you. So there's a comment from Miriam Al-Jamil on Roman charity as a subject, often provocative, sexualized element in its representations.
Yes, that was the that was the example of the Roman woman who kept her father in prison alive by breastfeeding him through the bars of the prison. A common subject of painting, but yes, clearly with sort of provocative, sexualized connotations. There's some very unusual 18th century visual treatments of that theme, incidentally, and it sort of appears famously at the end of Byron's Childe Harold as well, when that character goes to Rome. But yeah, it's a very, very different understanding of what, you know, charity saving force and its sustaining force actually means, the form it takes, which again perhaps alerts us to some of the you know, sexual and power dynamics at play in some philanthropic relationships.
And Joelle DeRose commenting on goody two shoes, so glad you brought this up, and then cites the Emotional Objects Conference in London from 2013, featuring a keynote address on tokens from the London Family Hospital.
Fantastic.
If anyone's interested. So, oops, one more message. Oh, just thank yous, lots of thank yous. I think we're sort of at the end of our hour. Can I just very briefly ask, I'm wondering, in connection to the Louisa Maid of Haystack, when a particular story or almost kind of celebrity figure becomes a kind of mechanism for raising money for a type. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So can you use Louisa as a means to raise money for people that are mentally ill generally? Or is it in the 18th century just a specific person?
So far as I'm aware, it tended to be specific to the person, and the philanthropy centered on the needy individual. But we don't, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that inspiration or people were inspired by it to look after people local to them who were in similar need. There's a whole host of Louisa made of the haystack related publications, including a play, including poetry. They are all centered on her. But of course, as the materials circulate around, it's highly probable that people reflected on similar need near them, and one hopes acted to help.
Okay, thanks. So lots of wonderful praise for your fascinating, elegant, assured presentation. And wonderful use of collections. So thank you, Andrew. And thank you everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And it's thank you for inviting me. And it's a lovely audience, and I really appreciate the questions. So thank you very much.
And this will be online, so look for that eventually. Thanks, everyone.
Hey.